Looking at the works of art that Japanese blades are, you can see that a lot of work must have gone into creating knives that are among the sharpest in the world. No surprise that these Japanese knives are so sharp, especially as they are created in a similar fashion to the world-famous Japanese export known as katanas. To make things even better when it comes to these knives, it turns out that they are created from the rarest Japanese steel. With that in mind, take a look at how these amazing knives are forged in the islands of Japan. Thanks to a swordsmith known as Sukehira Hirata and Nodoka Hirata, the representative of his workshop, we get to see the steps skilled blacksmiths and swordsmiths such as Sukehira and Nodoka have to take to make these sharp knives. To get things started, we found that Sukehira has to get his hands on what is known as Tamahagane. This substance is special because it is considered to be the rarest type of steel in all of Japan. Once this is done, we can truly begin the process of making the sharpest knives in Japan. Sort the iron sand. Once we get our hands on the Tamahagane, the blacksmith would also have to get their hands on some satetsu, which is also known as iron sand. Since it is mixed with things such as beach sand and crushed seashells, the blacksmith will have to separate the satetsu from the impurities with a magnet. This is a delicate process because you will still need some sand to make the knives as perfect as possible. We just need to make sure that there isn't too little or too much sand in the mix. Prepare the furnace and smelting the sand. Once we have sifted through the satetsu, the next thing that we need to do is prepare the furnace for work. This involves loading some coal in the furnace to the halfway point. The next thing to do is to heat it up and keep it hot by using a blower that will blow oxygen into the furnace from time to time. After about an hour or so, the furnace should have heated up to an ideal 1300 degrees Celsius. Once this temperature is achieved, the coal on the top of the furnace is lit. That way, the smelting process can actually begin. During this process, we found that small quantities of the iron sand is sprinkled on top of the furnace every 10 or so minutes from this point. This is done so that the iron won't stick too much. If that happens, it could fall to the bottom of the furnace and we know nobody is sticking their hand in there. Drain the slag. After some time, the blacksmith will have to carry out the first checks. This is done in a bid to prevent any impurities from collecting at the bottom of the furnace. Sure, this doesn't always happen, but it is just best to keep an eye on things in order to guarantee the best output. Once the blacksmith is satisfied with his check, he then clogs up the hole at the bottom of the furnace with some clay. Following this, the slag is drained once every 20 minutes. After some more attempts to drain it, you may find it slowly starts to appear so it is filtered from the iron. This cycle of adding sand to the furnace and draining the slag that forms it every so often will take about 8 hours or so of the blacksmith's time as he waits for the entire 30 kilograms worth of material. Do things right and you will get the perfect substance to carry out the work of creating these beautiful knives. Disassemble the furnace. Once the iron sand is depleted, the blacksmith will proceed by breaking the furnace down. This is a delicate process because the coal inside is still burning. Once this process is done, the blacksmith can now get his hand on the treasure he's been after. Tamahagane steel, collection and weighing of the steel. With the steel in full view, the blacksmiths will find that it may be too big for them to chop up at that point in time. As such, they will process the steel by beating and pounding it down to manageable chunks. Still steaming at temperatures upwards of 800 degrees Fahrenheit, the steel is then placed into some water so that it can cool down. That way it can now be measured and sorted before we can continue with the next steps. This is great because now they can use one of the rarest forms of steel to create the knives that are admired by the entire planet. That said, there is a bit of sadness about the process because even in Japan, we don't see this process take place as often as it did in the past. Once the steel is collected and weighed, the blacksmith can go about the process of converting the steel into knives. With that in mind, the blacksmith goes on to make the fire that he needs to get his work done. This means that he will have to make a fire pit that is just as hot as the furnace. This is the only way he can make that steel bend to his will. Once the steel is heated up, it is folded with a technique known as orikaishi. This process is done about 10 times so that the steel can be as durable as possible. It also helps to purify the piece of steel at the same time. Following this, the piece of steel is beaten into submission over the fire. That is the only way it may begin to take shape in the hands of the blacksmith. Once the blade begins to take shape, the top is removed from the rest of the steel. This brick of steel is then taken and beaten into its final form. This process takes a lot of years to learn, as a blacksmith can take about 5 or so years to learn his trade, and still it takes decades for him to perfect the art of making these knives. Perhaps that is why there are only about 300 people that practice this trade today, and even out of that, only 50 can make a living out of it. That's why we must appreciate these knives as much as we can. Forging the knife, grinding, and shaping. To make sure that the knives come out well, the blacksmiths will have to make sure that the temperature of the fire is maintained well. This means that the fire will have to be fed coal consistently. All through this period, the blade is beaten as often as possible in a bid to bend it into the ideal shape. That said, you will need more than hammering to make sure the knife will be as sharp and as precise as possible. To make sure it is even sharper, the blacksmiths today make use of a belt sander. After grinding away for some time, the edges of the knife become sharper and finalize the outline before the blade goes through the final heating process, quenching the steel. For the blade to go through the process of quenching, the first thing that the blacksmith will need to do is to cover the blade in this ground-up mix of clay and water. There is some science to this, as the parts that are thinly coated are the parts that will go through the most intense heat, while the parts that are thickly covered would not go through as much heat. Once this is done, the heated blade is quickly placed into a cold bucket of water. That would make the steel as strong as it could possibly be while it is cooling down. When the blade is removed from the water, you can see that it is covered by a white substance. This is because some parts of the steel had peeled off while it was expanding. To get rid of the whiteness, the blacksmith will have to scrape the whiteness off with another sharp object. Once this is done, he can wipe the blade clan with some water before going on to heat it up a bit more. This is done if the metal is a bit strained. Once beaten a bit more into shape, the blacksmith can push on by polishing the blade and sharpening on the whetstone. This involves polishing the blade on a belt sander. This will give the blade a better appearance while also refining the sharp edges of the blade. This is gone gradually so that the blade can come out in the best form possible. Following this, the blacksmith will go on to sharpen the blade on a whetstone. That way we can get that incredibly sharp edge that we have come to expect from this knife. Pretty neat stuff. The edge becomes so fine that it is impossible to see when viewed straight on, fitting the handle. When the blacksmith is happy with how sharp the knife is, he can finish off the knife making process by fitting the blade into its handle. To make sure that the knife fits in with the handle as best as possible, the blacksmith shapes the blade a bit more with an angle grinder. Sure, it hurts, but once this is done, the blacksmith then puts the first knife in the handle. To complete the entire knife making process, the knife is signed by its creator. Pretty amazing stuff, right? Now you know how to make the sharpest knife from the rarest steel in Japan.